With blinding speed and precision, Marie acted, swiftly incapacitating the officers without inflicting lethal damage. Their bodies crumpled to the ground, unconscious but alive. Jake let out an exasperated sigh, clearly unimpressed by the lack of bloodshed. Marie, on the other hand, regarded him with a cold, unyielding gaze. She had no intention of allowing him to escalate the situation further. The higher-ups would not tolerate the additional scrutiny that came with harming law enforcement, and she had no desire to clean up the mess Jake was so eager to create. Jake, unfazed by her disapproval, shrugged and pointed toward the vampire, who still bore the evidence of his earlier brutality. His clothes were stained with blood, a clear indicator of his reckless carnage. "This is your fault," Jake muttered, half amused, half irritated. "Walking around like that was bound to draw attention. Maybe if you'd bothered to clean up, we wouldn't have these problems." Before Marie could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps drew their attention. Heavy and deliberate, the cadence of the stride was unmistakable. It was not another police officer, nor was it an ordinary civilian. A tall man with long blonde hair and a black suit emerged from the shadows, his posture exuding an air of confidence and authority. It was Frankenstein. He walked with measured steps, coming to a halt between the unconscious policeman and the three individuals who had just rendered them defenseless. His piercing gaze swept over the scene, assessing every detail with quiet calculation. Jake and Marie tensed instinctively, recognizing the unmistakable aura of power that radiated from the man. Though they had never encountered him before, they could sense that he was not someone to be taken lightly. The vampire beside them emitted a low, guttural growl, his body stiffening as if responding to an unspoken threat. Jake smirked, sensing the unease in the air. "Well, this complicates things," he murmured, glancing at Marie. He had anticipated resistance, but this was an unforeseen variable. "Seems like it'll be a bit harder to keep things quiet after all. What do you think, Marie? Should we just let him go because he's got a pretty face?" Marie remained silent, her expression unreadable. She was studying the man, trying to gauge his intentions. Unlike Jake, she was not prone to reckless decisions. Every move she made was calculated, weighed against the consequences that might follow. Frankenstein, unfazed by their presence, met their gaze with calm indifference. He was not rattled by the hostile atmosphere, nor intimidated by the tension crackling between them. He had seen far worse and faced far greater threats. His presence alone was a statement, a challenge that needed no words. Jake, ever the provocateur, leaned slightly forward, his smirk widening. "And get rid of that face especially," he added, his voice dripping with amusement. He did not expect a response, but to his surprise, Frankenstein spoke. His voice was smooth, composed, yet edged with something unshakable. "I don't know how to feel about that statement," he mused, his lips curving into a confident smirk of his own. "But I will take it as a compliment." The moment stretched, the city's silence amplifying the weight of their unspoken challenge. The confrontation was inevitable. The only question that remained was who would make the first move. Jake let out a chuckle, his voice dripping with amusement as he observed the man before him. It was evident that Frankenstein had yet to fully grasp the gravity of the situation. Despite the unconscious officers lying on the ground, there was no trace of panic or hesitation in his demeanor. His composure irked Jake, making him wonder if the man was hiding something. To remain so calm in the face of an obvious threat, either he was overconfident or he had an ace up his sleeve. Testing his suspicions, Jake turned to the vampire beside him and, without hesitation, issued a simple command. Without needing further instruction, the creature lunged at Frankenstein with unnatural speed, his fangs bared and his eyes gleaming with the hunger for blood. However, before the vampire could even register what had happened, he was caught mid-air. Frankenstein's hand had shot forward in a blur, his fingers closing tightly around the creature's throat. The impact was immediate. The vampire's attack was halted, his body writhing as he clawed at the hand that now held him in an iron grip. His fangs dripped with saliva, his eyes wide in shock as he struggled in vain to break free. Jake and Marie watched, their expressions betraying their disbelief. Frankenstein, however, remained entirely indifferent to the scene unfolding before him. He examined the creature in his grasp with a mixture of disinterest and mild irritation. Saliva trickled down the vampire's mouth, much to Frankenstein's disgust. He sighed as if inconvenienced. His grip tightened slightly, making the vampire gasp as he fought for air. Displeased, Frankenstein finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. He preferred his clothes to remain unsoiled, free from such unpleasantness. It was only then that his sharp eyes took note of the bloodstains on the vampire's clothes. Had this creature attacked someone recently? His gaze shifted to the unconscious officers on the ground, and a thought crossed his mind: had this vampire been responsible for their state? Jake, however, was focused on something else entirely. A small smirk played on his lips as he exhaled a puff of smoke. He had misjudged Frankenstein, assuming he was nothing more than a show-off. Now, things were becoming more interesting. His earlier assumption had been wrong, and he wasn't about to ignore this revelation. Without breaking eye contact, he asked a question that made Frankenstein pause. Had he been the one to intercept it? The word lingered in Frankenstein's mind. Intercepted. He quickly deduced that Jake must have mistaken him for someone else. It was a misconception that could prove useful. If he played along, he might be able to gather more information. Jake, on the other hand, found the situation almost amusing. They had been looking for this man, and now he had conveniently appeared before them. Frankenstein carefully chose his next words, keeping up the pretense. He feigned exasperation, questioning why they were after him. But Jake was far from fooled. He scoffed at the feigned ignorance, making it clear that deception would be futile. There was no point in playing innocent, not when the truth was already known. Where was the coffin? The mere mention of the word sent Frankenstein's mind racing. The coffin? Could it be? Could these individuals be connected to the very object that had once held his master? Were the strange occurrences surrounding them in any way related to Rye? Jake continued, barely giving Frankenstein a moment to process. He openly admitted that he doubted Frankenstein had come to lead them to the coffin willingly. Even so, he found it amusing that someone would show up at a scene like this, assuming they could handle the situation. His laughter echoed in the otherwise silent street, a sharp contrast to the tension hanging in the air. He turned to Marie, expecting her to share in his amusement. Marie, however, remained silent, her gaze fixed on the ground. Her lips curled into a knowing smirk, but she didn't humor Jake's theatrics with a response. Frankenstein, meanwhile, was assessing the situation carefully. He needed to prevent this from escalating any further in such a public space. A fight here would draw unnecessary attention. So, he made a suggestion, one that was meant to minimize the collateral damage. They should change locations. Jake stopped laughing abruptly. The suggestion was unexpected, and for a brief moment, he processed the implications behind it. Then, amusement returned to his features, but this time it was laced with condescension. Did this man truly believe he had the luxury of dictating how things played out? The idea that someone as insignificant as Frankenstein would worry about causing a scene was laughable. There was no need for such precautions, not when getting rid of a small fry like him would be effortless. Marie, however, intervened. She reminded Jake that their objective wasn't to eliminate Frankenstein, but to interrogate him. They needed him alive. Jake wasn't entirely convinced. He assured her that he could capture their target without making a spectacle out of it. But Marie was insistent. There were too many people around. Annoyed, Jake clicked his tongue. He didn't appreciate being dictated to, but he saw no point in arguing over such a minor detail. With an exaggerated sigh, he conceded. Fine. They would change locations. Elsewhere, the night continued to stretch on, its darkness growing deeper with each passing moment. Inside Frankenstein's lounge, Rye sat motionless, his patience beginning to wear thin. Minutes turned to hours, and still, there was no sign of his companion. His unease grew. and he finally decided that waiting was no longer an option. Rising from the sofa, he moved toward the main door with slow, deliberate steps. He stopped before it, staring at the handle with mild frustration. Something so simple, and yet it remained an obstacle. The mechanics of opening a door, such a trivial task for most, eluded him. For a moment, he contemplated his options, weighing his next course of action. Then, he reached his conclusion. As expected, he would have to take the window. The concept of operating a door was still beyond him. Under the cold glow of the moon, a skeletal construction site loomed in the silence of the night, its unfinished beams and exposed framework casting jagged shadows under artificial lighting. The skeletal structure bore witness to 4 figures standing amidst the dust and steel, facing each other in an unspoken challenge. The night air carried an eerie stillness, broken only by the sound of footsteps echoing across the unfinished floor. Jake tilted his head, a smirk playing at the corners of his lips as he eyed Frankenstein with a mix of amusement and irritation. "Is this location good enough?" he asked, his voice laced with impatience. Frankenstein stood tall, his posture composed and unreadable. He observed Jake for a moment before speaking. "I'd like to make a suggestion." Jake raised a brow, folding his arms across his chest. "A suggestion?" "If I can capture you," Frankenstein continued, his voice unwavering, "I'd like for you to answer my questions without my having to interrogate you. Of course, I'd do the same for you if you capture me. None of us want to waste time, do we? Your answer?" Jake's smirk twisted into an irritated scowl as he gritted his teeth. "This isn't funny anymore, just irritating." Marie, who had been standing silently by his side, finally spoke. "He just needs to be able to answer our questions. Do as you like." Jake let out a low chuckle, his amusement rekindled. "Cuckoo, you can talk even without a limb or two." He rolled his shoulders, cracking his knuckles before lunging forward. "I'll make you beg for your life." He swung his claws toward Frankenstein, his speed nearly imperceptible to the naked eye. But Frankenstein moved effortlessly, stepping aside as though he had already predicted the attack. Jake's claws swiped at nothing but air, slicing through the dust that lingered in the cold night air. Jake narrowed his eyes, momentarily taken aback. "Not a bad dodge. It seems you're confident in your skills." He took a step forward, his movements growing more aggressive. "How about this one?" Once again, Frankenstein avoided the attack with almost unnatural ease, shifting to the side as Jake's claws narrowly missed him. There was no hesitation in Frankenstein's movements, only calculated precision, as if dodging Jake's assaults required no effort at all. Marie watched silently, analyzing Frankenstein's movements with a critical eye. The infected vampire beside her, still wary from their previous encounter, took an unconscious step backward. Jake let out a frustrated growl. His body tensed as he prepared to launch another attack. But before he could make his move, Frankenstein's fist shot forward, packed with an immense aura of energy. In an instant, his strike connected with Jake's torso, the force behind the punch sending him flying across the construction site. The sheer power of the impact left deep wounds across Jake's chest, his body skidding across the rough ground before coming to a halt. Marie and the vampire froze in disbelief. The ease with which Frankenstein had overpowered Jake was beyond their expectations. Frankenstein straightened his posture, his face as calm as ever. "Ah, my mistake." His voice carried a mocking undertone. "I haven't heard your answer yet." Jake groaned in pain, his hands gripping at the wounds on his torso. His teeth clenched, his body trembling from the shock of the attack. He had been overconfident, assuming Frankenstein was nothing more than a well-dressed nuisance. But this was something else entirely. Meanwhile, in Frankenstein's house, Rye wandered through the dimly lit halls, his crimson eyes glancing around in mild impatience. The mansion was unnaturally quiet, save for the soft hum of the evening breeze filtering through the cracks. Something about Frankenstein's prolonged absence unsettled him. He had waited long enough. He moved toward the massive windows lining the lounge, staring outside into the night. The moon hung high, casting its pale glow upon the city below. He lifted his hand and gestured toward the blinds, and in response to his silent command, they slid open without resistance. The view remained unobstructed, the cold night stretching out before him. Satisfied, he turned his attention to the glass windows. He lifted his hand again, expecting them to open as effortlessly as the blinds. However, when he gestured, the windows remained shut. He tried once more, but the result was the same. A faint clinking sound echoed through the room as the latch prevented the windows from opening fully. A moment of silence followed as Rai stared at the glass, contemplating his next course of action. He attempted again, but the windows merely rattled in defiance. He sighed softly. "What should I do?" His expression remained unreadable as he considered his predicament. Frankenstein had always been meticulous about his belongings, perhaps overly so. His attachment to his possessions bordered on obsessive, and Rai had no doubt that his insistence on security extended even to the windows. For a moment, he stood in thought, his crimson gaze fixed on the city beyond the glass. He could simply break through it if he wished, but that would undoubtedly displease Frankenstein. And despite his centuries of existence, Rai had learned that certain battles were best avoided, especially those involving Frankenstein's temper over damaged property. Deciding against reckless destruction, Rai turned away from the window. He would find another way to reach Frankenstein. He always did. Back at the construction site, the air was thick with tension. Jake slowly pushed himself up, wiping the blood from his mouth as his gaze burned with fury. Frankenstein stood before him, his expression unchanged, as if the fight had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Marie narrowed her eyes. Things were not going as she had expected. Frankenstein was far more dangerous than they had assumed, and now they would have to reassess their approach. The four figures stood in the partially constructed building, the dim lighting casting long shadows across the unfinished structure. Frankenstein faced Jake, Marie, and the infected vampire, each standing firm in their positions. Jake's shirt hung in tatters, exposing deep wounds that ran across his chest. Blood seeped from the cuts, but he remained upright, his expression shifting from frustration to intrigue. He had underestimated the man before him. This realization dawned upon him as he wiped the blood from his lips, contemplating his next move. His overconfidence had nearly cost him, but now he intended to rectify his mistake. Determined to retaliate, Jake lunged forward, his fist tightening as he aimed a punch directly at Frankenstein. The force of his movement sent a rush of air through the space, but at the last moment, Frankenstein sidestepped with effortless precision. Jake's fist collided with a nearby wall, and the sheer force of his strike shattered the concrete instantly, sending debris flying in all directions. The sound of destruction echoed through the skeletal building, but Jake barely noticed. His focus remained entirely on Frankenstein, whose expression betrayed no sign of fear or hesitation. Jake's movements were shifting, adapting, growing sharper with each moment. Readjusting his stance, Jake unleashed another devastating blow, this time aiming at the ground where Frankenstein had just been standing. His transformed arms, grotesque and powerful, bore a striking shade of deep purple, with sharp pink spikes protruding along their length. As his fist made contact with the unfinished flooring, the impact left a deep crater in the ground, sending dust and rubble into the air. He reveled in his own power, amused by the way the terrain crumbled beneath him. The change in his form had been gradual but unmistakable. It had been years since he had last taken this shape, and he could feel the raw strength coursing through him. His newfound abilities had granted him immense power, though at the cost of precision. His attacks lacked the necessary accuracy, but he knew it was only a matter of time before he gained full control. His confidence soared as he flexed his mutated arms, admiring their sheer destructive potential. This transformation, he believed, was a testament to evolution itself, the next stage in humanity's progress. The history of mankind had always been defined by conflict and destruction. and now he had become the embodiment of that truth. He considered himself to be the product of human desire, the culmination of their thirst for power. Marie, standing a short distance away, observed the unfolding battle with calculated detachment. She understood Jake's tendencies, knew how he enjoyed the sound of his own voice when reveling in his power. However, time was not a luxury they could afford. With a single glance, she signaled her impatience, urging him to put an end to the confrontation. Her focus remained on their objective, and she had no intention of prolonging the fight unnecessarily. Jake acknowledged her unspoken demand, the amusement fading from his face as he cracked his neck in preparation. He no longer had an excuse to hold back. He was determined to end it swiftly. With newfound determination, he surged forward once again, this time with full control over his attacks. The air rippled with the sheer force of his movement as he closed the distance between himself and Frankenstein in an instant. The silence that had previously settled over the under-construction building was shattered by the loud, resonant impact of their clash. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the night grew even darker, an ominous presence lingering in the air as the battle escalated. Meanwhile, at Frankenstein's house, Rai paced restlessly, his mind clouded with impatience. He had waited long enough, and his concern for Frankenstein was growing by the minute. He was not one to sit idly while others engaged in battle. Standing before the massive window, he assessed his options. He raised a hand toward the blinds, and with a simple gesture, they slid open, revealing the night beyond. He then turned his attention to the glass itself, attempting to open it in the same manner. However, unlike the blinds, the window remained firmly locked. No matter how many times he repeated the action, the latch refused to budge. He was met with nothing more than a soft clinking sound, each failed attempt further testing his patience. For a moment, he considered his options. He knew Frankenstein well, his unwavering attachment to his possessions, his meticulous nature. The window was likely secured to prevent unnecessary disturbances, but at this moment, that detail was of little importance. He had no intention of standing still while Frankenstein faced unknown dangers. Without hesitation, he acted, applying brute force to the lock. The latch snapped, and the window finally gave way, opening fully to the cool night air. He was ready to leave, ready to find Frankenstein and stand by his side in whatever awaited them. Frankenstein moved with effortless precision, sidestepping Jake's attack as the transformed man's fist smashed into the wall beside him. The force of the impact shattered the concrete, embedding his hand deep into the structure. For a brief moment, Jake stared at himself in disbelief, unable to comprehend how his powerful strike had failed so miserably. As he raised his other hand, intent on delivering another attack, Frankenstein swiftly countered, unleashing his slashing power with deadly accuracy. Before Jake could react, deep wounds tore across his body, and he collapsed onto his knees, gasping for breath. Marie and the vampire observed the scene in utter shock. Jake, despite his transformation, had been reduced to this state so easily. His once overwhelming presence now seemed insignificant in the face of the mysterious power Frankenstein possessed. Jake's expression twisted in horror as he examined his injuries, his mind racing to understand why his body was failing him. His wounds, which should have already begun regenerating, showed no signs of healing. He had always relied on his rapid recovery as an assurance of his strength, but now he felt a cold realization creeping in this battle was not in his favor. Marie, usually calm and composed, found herself unsettled. She had witnessed Jake's strength firsthand, and for him to be rendered so helpless by a single opponent was unthinkable. Even though he had been caught off guard, the sheer difference in power was undeniable. Her thoughts raced as she watched Frankenstein, who remained composed, his piercing blue eyes locked onto his fallen opponent. There was no arrogance in his stance, only the quiet confidence of a man who had seen countless battles and knew exactly where he stood. As Frankenstein raised his hand, energy crackling around it, he prepared to deliver the finishing blow. His opponent had proven to be no real challenge, and he saw no reason to prolong the fight any further. However, Just as he was about to strike, Marie stepped forward, positioning herself between him and Jake. Her sudden movement was unexpected, but Frankenstein regarded her with mild amusement, acknowledging her as a silent observer who had finally decided to intervene. Jake, still on the ground, struggled to push himself up, refusing to accept defeat. His pride wouldn't allow it. He tried to dismiss his failure as a simple mistake, claiming he had merely let his guard down. But his body betrayed him. No matter how much he willed himself to stand, his limbs trembled under his weight, and the pain from his wounds intensified. It was then that he realized something was truly wrong. His body wasn't healing. The cuts Frankenstein had inflicted remained open, refusing to close, and the pain did not fade. Panic crept into his voice as he tried to convince himself that this was just a temporary setback, but deep down, he knew the truth. Marie observed his struggle in silence, her mind analyzing the situation. Jake's regenerative abilities should have already activated, yet his wounds showed no improvement. Even the injuries he had sustained from Frankenstein's initial attack remained fresh. There was something unnatural about this man standing before them. Frankenstein's power was beyond anything she had encountered before. For the first time, Marie felt uncertain about their mission. Their target was far more dangerous than anticipated. Without hesitation, she made the decision to retreat. There was no point in continuing a fight that was clearly unwinnable. Her duty was not to engage in unnecessary battles, but to fulfill the mission's objective. She turned away, making it clear that she was unwilling to continue. Jake, still stubbornly clinging to his pride, tried to protest, urging her not to abandon the fight. He believed that if she stepped in, she might be able to turn the tide. But Marie had already made up her mind. Fighting Frankenstein in their current state was futile. Ignoring Jake's protests, Marie calmly led the retreat. She had no intention of wasting any more time here. Frankenstein, watching them leave, knew that this was his opportunity to gain the answers he sought. He had humored Jake's arrogance and entertained the idea of an exchange, and now, with the battle seemingly over, he expected some form of resolution. His eyes remained fixed on Marie as she halted for a brief moment, glancing back with an unreadable expression. However, she dismissed the idea of negotiation entirely. She had never agreed to their so-called deal, and as far as she was concerned, Jake's reckless words meant nothing. If Frankenstein wanted answers, he would have to decipher them from the meaningless boasts Jake had uttered during the battle. Frankenstein remained still as he watched them disappear into the darkness, his expression unchanged. He had no interest in pursuing them. The battle had already served its purpose. Lowering his gaze, he finally noticed a tear in the sleeve of his suit. A minor detail, but one that indicated just how close Marie had come when she stepped in to shield Jake. He sighed lightly, brushing off the damaged fabric, before turning away from the battlefield. The encounter had raised more questions than it had answered. But one thing was certain: whatever their mission was, it involved forces that could no longer be ignored. M21 and M24 sat in a dimly lit room, their expressions tense and alert. The air was thick with unease, and the dim light cast long shadows against the walls. Their conversation was abruptly interrupted by the sound of the door swinging open with a sudden bang, making both of them jolt in surprise. Through the doorway, Marie entered, her steps measured and controlled, but there was an undeniable urgency in her demeanor. Behind her, the vampire struggled to support Jake, whose body sagged under the weight of his own injuries. The sight of Jake in such a state sent a wave of realization through M21. He took in the deep wounds that marred Jake's torso, the torn fabric of his clothes barely clinging to his battered frame. The damage was extensive, and it was clear that he had faced an opponent far stronger than anticipated. M21's mind immediately drifted to a previous encounter, and he found himself speculating whether the ones responsible for this were the same as last time. The possibility seemed almost certain. As he analyzed the situation, his thoughts were interrupted by Jake's sudden outburst. With a burst of frustration, Jake violently shoved the vampire away, sending him crashing into the nearby wall. His anger radiated off him in waves, his pride clearly wounded as much as his body. M21 watched, a smirk creeping onto his lips as he pieced together the events. Jake's behavior alone confirmed the truth: he had been defeated, and not just barely. It had been a clear and undeniable loss. Marie, ever composed, assessed the room before addressing M21. She gave a succinct explanation, confirming what he had already surmised. Jake had lost. There was no embellishment, no excuses, just a simple statement of fact. M21 took a moment to process this revelation, his mind racing with implications. He had hoped that Jake and Marie would be able to stand their ground against these formidable opponents, but this outcome proved otherwise. If Jake had been taken down so decisively, then their adversaries were even stronger than anticipated. More concerning was the fact that Jake and Marie couldn't be allowed to know that M21 and M24 had prior knowledge of their enemies. Carefully choosing his words, M21 feigned curiosity, probing for more information while ensuring his own knowledge remained concealed. He expressed surprise at the notion that anyone could stand against Jake in battle. Marie, with her usual detached manner, clarified that only Jake had fought. She had not engaged in combat, as her role did not necessitate it. This revelation made M21 pause. He had assumed that the fight had been 2-on-2, but now he realized that Jake had faced a single opponent, a blonde man. The moment those words left Marie's lips, M21's mind reeled. That description left no doubt he knew exactly who their opponent had been. The memory of their past encounter was still fresh, and now he knew the true extent of Frankenstein's power. If Frankenstein had defeated Jake single-handedly, then his strength was beyond anything they had imagined. M21 chose his response carefully, ensuring his reaction appeared natural. He claimed that if they had ever encountered someone powerful enough to defeat Jake, they wouldn't have lived to tell the tale. Marie seemed to consider his words before falling into silence, though it was unclear whether she believed him entirely. Across the room, Jake remained slumped against the cold wall, his breathing ragged and labored. The battle had not only left him physically battered, but had also taken a severe toll on his pride. He replayed the fight in his mind, each moment of his defeat burning into his thoughts. The pain of his injuries was insignificant compared to the humiliation of losing so thoroughly. His mind twisted with thoughts of revenge, of regaining his honor. Power, that was what he needed. More power, something beyond what he currently possessed. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms as he silently vowed that this humiliation would not stand. He would find a way to become stronger, no matter the cost. Meanwhile, far from the tense atmosphere of that room, Frankenstein arrived back home. The cool night air accompanied him as he stepped inside, his mind still sharp from the confrontation. His first thought was of his master. As he entered, he immediately sought Rai, addressing him in a respectful yet familiar manner. However, Rai did not respond. He sat silently, his eyes closed, his expression unreadable. Something about his posture felt different, and Frankenstein immediately sensed that something was amiss. A flicker of concern passed through Frankenstein's mind. Had something happened while he was away? He took a step closer, his sharp gaze scanning the room for any indication of disturbance. That was when his eyes landed on an object sitting on the table in front of him, a window latch. His brows furrowed in confusion as he tried to make sense of its presence. The realization struck him quickly: this was not something that should have been removed from its place. His thoughts pieced together the possible events that could have led to this discovery. Had someone attempted to leave through the window? His gaze flickered back to Rai, who had now risen from his seat and walked toward him. Without a word, Rai reached out and placed a hand on Frankenstein's shoulder, the gesture both simple and profound. There was no need for an explanation. Rai's actions spoke volumes. Whatever had transpired, whatever had been on his mind, he had chosen this moment to offer Frankenstein a sense of reassurance. The weight of the night's events settled upon Frankenstein's shoulders. Between his battle with Jake and this newfound mystery within his own home, there were more questions than answers. But one thing remained certain: whatever challenges lay ahead, he would be prepared to face them. The night was far from over, and the wheels of fate continued to turn, setting events into motion that none of them could yet foresee. The moon illuminated the streets as Frankenstein sat with Rye in his lounge. He reflected on his recent encounter, analyzing the nature of the individuals he had faced. They were humans, but unlike any he had encountered before. Their strength and abilities far exceeded those of ordinary men, making it clear that they were products of some experiment or artificial enhancement. He contemplated their connection to the mysterious circumstances surrounding Rye's coffin and realized that further investigation was necessary. His thoughts drifted to the battle he had fought. The individuals displayed incredible power, and despite being human, they had capabilities that suggested an unnatural origin. The torn state of his clothing served as a reminder of the confrontation. He speculated on the origins of these beings, questioning what kind of experiments had led to their creation. Throughout history, humans had sought power, delving into various means of enhancing their physical and mental capacities. The existence of these individuals suggested a breakthrough in such pursuits, marking a significant shift in what was once deemed impossible. The possibility that M21 and M24 were also created through similar means became evident. Their movements and abilities differed from those of normal humans, leading to the assumption that they too had undergone some form of artificial enhancement. His previous conversations with Rye came to mind, particularly the statement that those individuals did not belong anywhere. This revelation now made sense. They were not born into the world naturally, but rather created for a purpose beyond their control. Their existence was defined by the intentions of those who had experimented on them, leaving them without a true place in society. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit room, M24 felt a sharp pang in his chest. His body trembled as he reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small bottle. He poured a few pills into his palm and swiftly swallowed them, attempting to suppress the discomfort that had taken hold of him. M21 observed this action, his expression unreadable. The sight had become routine, yet it always carried an unspoken weight. M24, sensing the scrutiny, silently acknowledged the moment before returning his focus to the space before him. The silence in the room was abruptly interrupted by the sound of laughter. Jake, injured but still exuding an air of dominance, mocked those around him. He looked upon M21 and M24 with disdain, ridiculing their reliance on medication and their perceived weakness. The taunts cut deep as he highlighted their vulnerabilities, emphasizing the instability of their bodies and the limitations imposed upon them by their condition. His words carried an undeniable truth, a reality that both M21 and M24 were painfully aware of yet refused to acknowledge openly. M24 gritted his teeth but chose not to respond. He knew that engaging with Jake would lead to nothing but further humiliation. His strength paled in comparison, and despite his internal frustration, he understood that silence was the best response. M21, however, reacted differently. Anger surged through him as he stood, his body tense with restrained fury. The weight of Jake's words pressed heavily on him, igniting emotions he struggled to suppress. Jake, despite his condition, welcomed the challenge, his gaze filled with amusement. He recognized the resentment in M21's stance, daring him to act on it. The atmosphere grew thick with unspoken tension, as if a confrontation could erupt at any moment. M21's fists clenched, his emotions wavering between restraint and the overwhelming urge to retaliate. But before he could act, a hand on his shoulder stopped him. M24's gesture was subtle yet firm. It was not a command, but a silent plea for him to let it go. The look in M24's eyes carried a mixture of resignation and understanding, a quiet acknowledgement of their reality. They both knew that acting on impulse would lead to nothing but further suffering. M21 exhaled sharply, his shoulders lowering as he reluctantly relented. His gaze dropped to the floor, frustration still evident in his posture. The room fell into silence once more, the moment passing but leaving behind an undeniable weight. Jake, despite his mocking demeanor, said nothing further. His words had already accomplished their purpose, embedding themselves deep within those who had heard them. M21 and M24, though unwilling to admit it, carried the burden of their existence, knowing that they were bound by circumstances beyond their control. Elsewhere, Frankenstein reflected on his findings, contemplating the next steps. The night stretched on, filled with unanswered questions and unresolved tensions. The events that had unfolded hinted at a deeper mystery, one that would require time and effort to unravel. The presence of these powerful individuals, the origins of their abilities, and their connection to past experiments all intertwined into a puzzle waiting to be solved. The path forward was uncertain, but one thing was clear: this was only the beginning of something much larger than anyone could have anticipated. Jake sat there, a smirk playing on his lips as he let out a small chuckle. The tension in the room remained thick as M21 forcefully pushed the door open, the loud bang echoing through the dimly lit space. Without looking back, he stepped outside, his movements sharp and aggressive. M24 followed in silence, his gaze shifting between Jake and M21. There was no hesitation in his steps, yet an underlying unease lingered between them. Jake's laughter continued to ring through the air, a mocking edge evident in every sound he made. He found amusement in the hesitation he had witnessed, in the silence that followed his taunts. His confidence, though bruised by recent events, remained unshaken. Marie observed the scene, her calculating gaze taking in every detail. The situation had changed. They were not in a position to continue as they had originally planned. The mission had become more complicated than anticipated, and she recognized the necessity of stepping back. The lack of information was a glaring issue, and pushing forward blindly would only lead to more losses. The mission required a reassessment, new strategies, and a clearer understanding of the variables at play. The organization they were after remained shrouded in secrecy, and their unexpected encounter with the powerful opponent who had left Jake in such a state only reinforced the need for caution. Marie knew that this enemy was unlike any they had encountered before. His abilities were an anomaly, an unknown force that had disrupted their plans entirely. They needed to determine whether his power was inherent or if he was using an external force to suppress their regenerative abilities. The implications of either possibility were immense, and leaving it to chance was out of the question. Jake clenched his fists, a mixture of frustration and defiance clouding his expression. His instincts urged him to keep fighting, to prove his strength. But Marie's presence alone made it clear that his choice had already been made for him. They were retreating. The decision was final. She stated that they would be heading back to the laboratory in Korea, where he would receive treatment. The wounds he had sustained were not healing as they should, an anomaly that needed immediate attention. The mention of Dr. Krommel caught Jake off guard. The mere thought of one of the top bioengineering doctors of their organization being in Korea raised more questions than it answered. His presence there seemed unusual, almost deliberate, yet any attempt to question further was met with the expected response: some things were simply not for them to know. Frustration bubbled beneath the surface as Jake clicked his tongue, his mind racing with unanswered questions. Regardless of the reason behind Dr. Krommel's presence, one thing was certain: if anyone could determine why his regeneration had failed, it was him. Marie remained composed, her cold expression unwavering. She emphasized the need for information, for answers regarding the man they had encountered. Whether his strength was natural or aided by an external force, whether others like him existed, and what his presence meant for their mission, all of it demanded further investigation. His existence alone had thrown their plans into disarray. The unknown variables posed too great a risk. There was no room for recklessness now. Marie's words carried a weight that left no room for argument. The retreat was necessary. Jake could only grit his teeth in reluctant acceptance, knowing that despite his frustrations, there was no alternative. The mission had taken a turn neither of them had foreseen, and acting without understanding their adversary fully would be a mistake. Meanwhile, at Frankenstein's house, the atmosphere carried a different kind of intensity. Ryan Frankenstein stood before the main door, their expressions serious as they focused on the task at hand. For Rai, it was a moment of concentration, an exercise in overcoming the simple yet unfamiliar obstacle that stood before him. He lifted his finger, reaching toward the mechanical lock with precision. The small button he pressed responded with a low whirring sound, unlocking the door with a subtle yet satisfying click. He then reached for the handle, twisting it with deliberate care. A faint squeak accompanied the motion as the door slowly swung open, revealing the world beyond. Sunlight poured into the room, illuminating everything in its path, casting long shadows and bringing warmth to the otherwise dimly lit space. Rai had finally succeeded in unlocking and opening the main door. Frankenstein observed the moment with a sense of satisfaction, his pride evident as he acknowledged Rai's achievement. The significance of this seemingly simple task was not lost on him. It was a small yet meaningful step toward independence. Rai had learned something new, something that allowed him greater freedom. The accomplishment, though minor in a grander sense, carried weight in the moment. Frankenstein clapped in quiet applause, his expression one of encouragement. Rai stood still for a moment, absorbing the feeling of success, his gratitude evident even without words. The newfound ability to open the door meant more than just access. It symbolized the ability to step outside freely, to move beyond the confines of the house without reliance on another. It was a step toward self-sufficiency, however small it might seem. Frankenstein continued to regard him with admiration, acknowledging the effort it had taken to reach this point. The progress, however minor, was worth celebrating. He knew that for Rai, even the smallest accomplishments carried great meaning. Rai, in turn, recognized the role Frankenstein had played in guiding him to this moment. The effort had not been his alone, and he silently acknowledged the support that had brought him here. The atmosphere between them was one of mutual understanding, a quiet acknowledgement of progress. Frankenstein's expression remained warm, his presence unwavering in its support. Rai knew that with each step forward, he was not alone. He had Frankenstein by his side, a presence he could rely on without hesitation. As the door remained open, the sunlight continued to stream in, filling the space with a quiet warmth. The world beyond the threshold remained vast and unknown, yet it no longer felt entirely out of reach. Rai had taken a step toward embracing it, and Frankenstein stood by, ready to support him on whatever path lay ahead. The moment lingered, a silent testament to the bond between them. Frankenstein's pride remained evident, his quiet encouragement a constant presence. Rai, having accomplished what once seemed out of reach, stood with newfound confidence. The house remained unchanged, yet something within its walls had shifted. A door had been opened not just in the physical sense, but in a way that signified something greater. The moment held meaning beyond its simplicity, a quiet victory in its own right. Under the dim glow of the city lights, two figures stood atop a quiet rooftop, their gazes fixed on the sprawling urban landscape before them. M21 and M24 remained silent for a moment, the weight of their circumstances pressing heavily on them. They had been through countless battles, faced insurmountable odds, and yet they continued to survive. The scars on their bodies were reminders of their existence, products of cruel experiments, designed to be more than human but treated as expendable assets. They knew the organization that created them saw them as nothing more than tools, and even among their own kind, they were considered defective. M24 reached into his pocket, his hand trembling slightly as he retrieved a small bottle of pills. The side effects of the experiments they had endured were relentless. Without the medication, their bodies would begin to deteriorate, succumbing to an unbearable agony that threatened to consume them entirely. Over time, however, M21 had noticed a change within himself. The intervals between doses had grown longer until, finally, his body no longer required them. He believed that M24 would eventually reach the same state, but until then, the dependency on the pills remained a burden. The knowledge that their survival hinged on a small container of synthetic relief only reinforced their helplessness. Despite their circumstances, their thoughts drifted toward recent events. The encounter with Frankenstein had left a lasting impression on them. Jake, their supposed superior, had suffered injuries that defied logic. His regenerative abilities should have been more than sufficient to heal such wounds, yet there was no sign of recovery. M21 recalled his own injuries after the battle, noting that his healing had also slowed significantly. It was as though their regenerative abilities had been suppressed, rendering them vulnerable in ways they had not experienced before. He suspected that Frankenstein was responsible, though the exact mechanism remained a mystery. The implications of their recent battle weighed heavily on their minds. Marie had mentioned that only one opponent had been involved, but M21 knew better. There had been another presence, one far more powerful. The absence of this second figure was an enigma. If Frankenstein alone had been capable of overpowering them, then the other individual's strength remained an unknown factor. The thought was unsettling. If both of them had been present, the battle might have been over before it even began. For now, M21 and M24 resolved to observe from a distance. The identity of these individuals was intriguing, but their immediate priority was survival. They had sensed no hostility from them beyond the initial confrontation. As long as they refrained from provocation, they hoped they would be left alone. Despite this, the looming threat of their own organization was impossible to ignore. Jake's attitude toward them had always been one of disdain, but recently, his hostility had grown more apparent. It was not just a personal vendetta. There was something more behind his actions. M21 suspected that the organization itself was considering their disposal. They had always been expendable, but now it seemed as though the time for elimination was drawing near. Their failure to eliminate witnesses had only worsened their standing. If the organization learned that they had allowed outsiders to live, their fates would be sealed. M24, though often resigned to his circumstances, voiced his concerns. The thought that they were being actively targeted was a chilling one. The only silver lining was that, for now, the organization's attention seemed to be focused elsewhere. The presence of Frankenstein and his unknown ally had disrupted their mission, shifting priorities in ways they could not yet comprehend. Meanwhile, in a quiet, dimly lit lounge, Rye and Frankenstein sat in companionable silence, the soft clinking of porcelain the only sound between them as they sipped their tea. The tranquility of the moment was interrupted by the sudden ringing of Frankenstein's phone. He glanced at the screen and saw Shinwoo's name flashing. Something about the timing of the call unsettled him. Answering, he barely had time to greet the caller before Shinwoo's urgent voice rang out, filled with urgency. Before Frankenstein could respond, the call abruptly ended. Concern settled in as he turned to Rye, contemplating the possible reasons behind the unexpected call. The apartment complex where Frankenstein had first encountered the unusual figures was the same place Shinwoo resided. With the students currently staying at Yuna's place for safety, it was clear that someone was searching for them. The possibility that the organization had tracked them down was alarming. As Frankenstein considered his next move, the sudden chime of the doorbell drew his attention to the telecom screen. To his relief, it was only Shinwoo, Ikan, and Yuna standing outside. Their expression, however, were far from ordinary. Shinwoo's voice carried through the intercom as he announced their arrival, explaining that they had grown bored and decided to visit. He mentioned that since Rye was incapable of opening the door himself, they thought it best to arrive while Frankenstein was home. The room fell into a brief silence as Rye retreated to his seat, sipping his tea in an almost amused manner. Frankenstein, however, remained at the telecom, conflicted by the situation. He had expected something dire, but instead, the trio had simply arrived out of restlessness. After a moment of deliberation, he decided to let them in the unconventional way. Rather than opening the door, he suggested they climb over the fence. Confusion was evident in Shinwoo's voice as he questioned the request, but the decision had already been made. Frankenstein, despite his composed demeanor, couldn't help but find some humor in the moment. Shinwoo, Ikan, and Yuna sat comfortably in the lounge with Rye and Frankenstein, their laughter and chatter filling the air. The atmosphere was lively, the sound of crunching snacks and occasional bursts of amusement blending into the home's otherwise quiet and refined environment. The students had come over, assuming Rai must be bored spending days cooped up in the house. Their presence brought a vibrant energy, a stark contrast to the usual serenity of the place. Shinwoo, ever the energetic one, voiced their collective thought, wondering how Rai had been spending his time all alone. Frankenstein, a man who took great pride in maintaining a clean and organized space, found himself trying to ignore the growing mess in the room. Crumbs and wrappers littered the furniture and floor, an unbearable sight to his perfectionist nature. He took a slow, deep sip from his tea, attempting to suppress his irritation. A silent mantra repeated in his head: patience, calm, relaxation. They are my lovely students, he reminded himself, his internal struggle warring against his impulse to clean up immediately. Lost in thought, he failed to notice when Shinwoo called out his name. It was only when the boy repeated himself with a touch of concern that Frankenstein snapped back to the present. A brief pause followed as all eyes turned toward him, their expressions questioning. Realizing his lapse, he let out a small chuckle, offering an apology for his distraction. However, his students noticed something off about his expression. His face seemed a bit pale, his demeanor unusually distant. They voiced their concern, asking if he was feeling unwell. He brushed off their worries, assuring them he was fine, then redirected the conversation back to them. One of the students then raised a question about when they would be able to return to school. With the recent disturbances, concerns had started to mount regarding their academic progress, fearing they might fall behind compared to students from other schools. Frankenstein took a moment before responding, acknowledging that until the police deemed the area safe, classes would remain suspended. The authorities, he explained, were still struggling to find leads. Given the extraordinary nature of the incident, the investigation was proving difficult, but he remained hopeful that with time, they would receive good news. Shinwoo, though generally carefree, let out a sigh, complaining about the sheer boredom of their prolonged break. Just as he finished speaking, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. He casually took it out of his pocket, expecting a familiar name, but the moment he saw the caller ID, his face fell. The change in his expression was so drastic that it immediately caught Ikhan's attention. His friend leaned closer, questioning the source of his unease. The name displayed on the screen was Yuna. Confusion spread across the group as they processed the oddity. Yuna, sitting right there among them, could not possibly be the one calling Shinwoo. Ikhan chuckled, assuming it was some kind of joke. The idea of receiving a call from someone physically present seemed absurd. Yuna herself was puzzled but played along, thinking it might just be a mistake. Ikhan, still skeptical, dismissed the situation as a prank, joking that summer had long passed, and it was time to retire the ghost stories. But Shinwoo, his tone firm and unwavering, held up his phone to show them. The screen clearly displayed Yuna's name. A moment of silence settled over the group as the reality of the situation sank in. Yuna frowned, trying to recall any possible explanation. The only plausible answer was unsettling. She had lost her phone during the kidnapping incident. Her voice was solemn as she confirmed that her phone had been taken from her that day, and she had not replaced it since. The memory resurfaced for Shinwoo when the kidnappers had used Yuna's phone to contact him. He had not thought about it until now, but it all connected. Someone still had Yuna's phone, and now, for some reason, they were calling him with it. The weight of the situation settled over them, and without hesitation, Frankenstein stepped in. He calmly took the phone from Shinwoo, intending to answer the call himself. The students watched anxiously as he brought the device to his ear. A brief silence followed before a voice from the other end broke it. The voice on the line was unfamiliar, yet it carried a distinct tone of amusement, as if the caller had been expecting someone else to pick up. The stranger made a casual remark, noting that the voice they heard was not the brat's. They continued, recognizing Frankenstein's voice instantly. It seemed that their previous encounter had left an impression, as they confidently stated that there was no way they could forget him. The sentiment, they assumed, must have been mutual. Frankenstein remained silent, listening intently. The caller, unfazed by his lack of response, proceeded with their reason for calling. They revealed that Shinwoo had not been their intended contact. Their business was with Frankenstein and those around him. The request, or rather, the demand, was simple. They wanted to meet at the construction site where their paths had first crossed. With that, the call abruptly ended. Frankenstein lowered the phone from his ear, his expression unreadable. The students watched him expectantly, waiting for him to explain what had just transpired. He took a moment to process the implications of the call before turning back to them, his mind already formulating the next course of action. The enemy had made their move, and now it was time to respond. As the chairman snapped the phone shut, a sense of unease settled over the room.